there's no right answer about how we grow our skills and where we grow our product skills. Not every startup looks the same. Not every big company looks the same, but you have a lot of elements in each. I'm going to do 3 things. I'll tell you a little bit about myself just to give context on where my experience has been and how to think about the advice or non-advice I give. Second, just the environment of a startup versus a big company, what things are kind of traditional in either. And then third, I want to walk you through 5 product skills that I find really valuable, and then just take that as a lens of from a startup to a big company. Cool. So my journey, I have been in product for over 15 years. Just a little bit about me is I'm a big tech enthusiast, not about using tech for tech's sake, but I've always been so ever since I was a little kid with my dad was an electrical engineer, understanding how tech could empower people to live better lives and to make us more productive has kind of been a theme through my whole career. My whole product career has been around products that have been shaped by community members. And so a lot of that has led how I thought about product strategy and product growth. My last chapter, you'll see me here on stage. My last chapter was taking me from announcing Material U that just announced in Pixel 6 for the Android community to Common Room, which is a small but really mighty Series B startup that kind of very deeply believes in community and how that's shaping products. My journey is very, I'm sorry, did that change? Okay. So my journey is pretty classic through the PM ladder. I was a machine learning researcher at MIT. I went to Wellesley for undergrad in CS and econ. And I, out of college, I didn't really know I wanted to be a product manager. But I thought if I wanted to be in tech, I needed to be a software engineer or I needed to be a tester. And it turned out every interview I had, people said, you should try product, which I've loved. So I started out very early at Microsoft. I was one of the first of 3 PMs that were on the C# programming language. So imagine being a PM in a space where you're trying to build and grow a programming language that doesn't yet exist to compete against something like the Java programming language, or C# is now number 5 language in the entire world based on the TOB index. So that was a lot about what does it need to create a language like that. I then later became a product lead and a GPM on Visual Studio, thinking about how do you build developer tools that help people, build better apps faster. Early stages in all of my experience here was a theme about building 0 to 1 products, which I didn't know at that time in large companies, really shaped how I thought about product and how I was lucky enough to actually create the beginning of these products in these spaces. I thrive in ambiguity. And so a lot of what you're gonna hear from my experience here is as I grew as a product manager with a number of these skills, you'll find that creating clarity from ambiguity was a huge part of something that I enjoyed doing and that I ended up being really good at. I took a little bit of a detour, which I thought at the time was a detour, out of product to become a chief of staff, which I did for 18 months at Microsoft. That turned out to be not a detour. So a lot of you who might be thinking about product skills, both at a startup or a big company, there's so much that you do that is outside of this discipline. As a chief of staff, I did everything from understanding how to run a business to thinking about COGS to vendor management. Also, 2 really important things. One was understanding how culture is built for a team and how do people live out a culture in a team that you want to create, and then also how innovation happens from small companies to big companies and where that best happens. Innovation happens across all of that. I was then at Google as a director of product. I ran all the developer tools for Android, also in spaces where we were thinking about rebuilding Android, and then now I'm at Common Room. So when you think of startups, think of all the things that you think about. There's one of the engineering managers I work with now, Dylan, always uses this meme. And it really is this. It's this idea of you are building something so quickly and moving so fast that you barely have time to lay out down the tracks in front of you. And I think it's kind of a great meme for that. When you think about the 2 sets of companies, since I'm going to talk about product skills in both, these are a couple ways that I really think are, comparisons. And again, no startup looks the same. There's elements of it. And then every experience you might have in a bigger company might actually turn out to be so similar to what you might find in a startup, which is what I found in some of my teams at Google coming here to Common Room. One of the things about the startup that you'll expect just from an environment perspective is there is a ton of ambiguity. Depending on what stage that startup is, you are probably in a phase of potentially finding market fit. There's a lot of ambiguity to create clarity from versus kind of a larger established company, a little bit more structure. That structure means that you can learn from a ton of things. It also means that if you can enter spaces that would be really difficult to do as a startup. Startups often have a runway of resourcing and financing, where if you were doing the same innovation in a large company with that structure, so for instance, if you're building something that needs to enter a market that requires hardware, you have more time and resources in a larger company. At a startup, you tend to have a bit more velocity. So what you're doing is you're building and you have early market fit. So you'll find hopefully a greater degree of velocity at a startup versus at a larger company. The impact of opportunity is great, but there's a lot more alignment that you'll need to do across larger teams and different disciplines. So alignment is like a huge part of that. Impact is across both. So I definitely find that you have impact as an individual PM and also as a company, both at a startup and a big company. That impact at a big company might look on a smaller scale. You might be a feature PM for a smaller feature, but have very, very large impact. As an example, for C#, we didn't have anyone kind of using C#. We had a ton of people using .NET. My first feature that I designed was something called Edit and Continue that allowed people to continue developing while they were building C#. First time I ever shipped that still had over 500,000 people use that the day of. At a startup, you're a bit more scrappy. So you'll find this also in big companies. The way that Android and Google was like, it's very scrappy environment as well. The bigger companies tend to have more resources. So that means you can often split out different tasks. There might be a difference between somebody who runs pricing versus somebody who runs marketing is a little bit more common at a big company. And then at a startup, this one kind of goes back to us as a PM in your craft. You are a bit more independent often, depending on what your startup looks like in building your own career versus a larger company often has an established promo process, career levels, and career model that you can also lean on as well. So these are the 5 product skills that I'm going to talk about today in context of a large company and a startup. There are many, many more. There are many letters that people use for it. These are the ones that I often think in terms. The first one is really around product sense and around strategy. So it's about thinking about building the right product for the right customer in the right market. The second one, product design, I'm really using to describe the craft of deeply designing an actual product. So this would mean like you figured out the problem space, you want to build something, and it's where the buttons lie. When you do a sign-on process, where do people put their email? What's the friction of that experience? But it's the craft of actually designing an end-to-end product down to the very little details. Third is around creating clarity. And for me, that one is, it's a huge part of everything that we do as product managers. It's communication, execution, prioritization, but really your role is how do you create clarity for those around you on what is the right thing to build and what are the right things to focus on. 4 is leadership. And so that often talks about influence or about shaping potentially a roadmap or leading a team. And then 5 is how to think about scaling a product organization in context of this. So product sets first. You will learn this at both, but at a big company, you'll probably start as a PM for a single feature. So that might mean you own the share feature on, Microsoft Office, or it might mean you own Edit Continue for C#, or you own the payments, platform for a part of a company. At a startup, you will probably own like a much bigger area, but startups have no safety net. So because you're still trying to find market fit, at the core of product sense is customer empathy and really understanding if you are meeting somebody's understanding pain points, figuring out value realization, and then being able to translate that value realization into how you design it into a product. Another example of this here for product sense is you will learn at both. An example at Google was if you were an L5 PM, the idea is that we knew that a rocket needed to go a certain direction. An analogy that was often used is that you can flawlessly get that rocket to where it should go independently. As an L6 or if at a higher level, it might mean that you need to define where that rocket would be. So you get a chance to shape a product in context of a larger thing, where at a startup, you will learn this very, very quickly, but you are probably trying to find market fit and iterating very quickly. So it will force you to get that customer empathy right. I'm going to quickly kind of go through this just from timing, but this is an example of in the developer world, oftentimes in programming languages or apps, you might, apps used to start out and say, you'd have to describe everything that you want an app to run on. So take, for example, if this was like coffee machine, imperative framework would have been saying like, I want a cup of coffee. So I would need to describe everything I would need to do. I would need to grind the coffee beans. I would need to put the coffee beans in a coffee maker. I would want the water to run through it. And then I would want to, control the water temperature, and then I would create coffee. So that's very step-by-step description of what an app should do. A declarative model would be, my intent is to have a cup of coffee. So I would like a cup of coffee. That was kind of the difference in the programming world of these two mental models. And one of the things I kind of built in at Google was just kind of like recognizing that there is this trend of declarative frameworks to describe what an app should do versus not. That led to this product called Jetpack Compose as just kind of an example of product sense here. In my world today, another example here is something that we're calling product-led growth. So if you think about the last time you adopted a product that you loved, it was probably not, maybe you found it on the web, you probably heard it from a friend, but it's this idea that you love products and then you want to share them. And you get to try them for free. So you might find an app on the App Store. And so this concept of product-led growth is happening everywhere. This is kind of the basis of where Common Room is built on, which is there's no concept of like this top-down adoption, but really people are loving products. And then they're translating it to their friends or their community. And that's how product adoption is happening. So what kind of product would you build in a space knowing that this trend might be happening? Second kind of category is in product design. One of the things here is really, this is what I meant by the art of designing a product. This looks, in terms of deliverable, very similar to a product requirements doc. It could be a spec. It could be a presentation that you're actually describing what that framework would look like. But the art of doing product design, this is a craft that we end up honing. And so at a startup, you will probably get a bigger rock. I work with a great PM, Kyle, who was kind of asking, how big is this particular thing? We're working on a feature kind of called lists. And at a startup, you'll kind of get a space that is probably 4 or 5 larger feature teams. And so you'll get the chance to design very large things all the way down to the details. The trade-off is that at a larger company, you might have started out with just one feature, which was, I want to notify people when something changes with this group of people. So the trade-off is more having the ability and the guidance to kind of hone a craft. The benefit of getting both is if you join kind of a world of a startup where you get a large space, but you still have people around you that can help hone that craft, you'll kind of get a bit of both. Okay. The third space here is really around creating clarity. And for me, this is really the heart of what a product manager does. We talk about many things that PMs should do, but really you want to take ambiguity and make order to it. So here it's really around figuring out how to ruthlessly prioritize. We are often pulled in so many different directions. You might have, 7 customers asking for something. You have a bunch of things that you didn't finish from the last sprint. You have your CEO asking for a set of things, and then that you should be building, a couple compete items that should go there. How do you figure out which one to do next? That's the art and the craft of prioritizing based on imperfect data. This is also areas where you could be creating roadmaps, thinking about objectives and aligning people on objectives. It's execution and also storytelling and communication. So I often think about your role as a product manager as how to create clarity and how do you learn how to make good decisions in that option, in that world. A couple of thoughts here is When you find yourself saying that you should have many different options that we put in the product, it's probably a case where we couldn't decide. There are some cases where it makes a lot of sense to do options, but I often think of options as the enemy of clarity. If you keep, if you work with your engineering team and you're finding that you can't quite make a decision or quite can't crystallize, the questions I would be asking, or that you might think about asking, is, what do I need to bring more confidence into a decision that I have? Where are areas that I can gather more customer feedback? What is data that I could use to help me know which angle to go? But the goal is to take the next step to help you be able to reduce the number of options. I also think creating clarity is in the little things. So here you'll get this in both a startup and a big company, but you'll find that there's probably an idea of what is spec'd or what you think the product should do. All the details, all the way down to where buttons are, how it's designed, and the clarity comes in the little things as well. It's the day-to-day of what an error message is or why you should take one route or another. And then the whole goal is funneling from open-ended to concrete. Comparison between startup and a big company, you'll learn both in both cases. There's so much more ambiguity often in a startup that you will learn how to hone the skill really well, or you'll find that it's not a great environment for you. Fourth is just leadership. So there's so many parts of leadership. One thought here is your ability to influence. It could be a roadmap, it could be an idea, but there's a couple elements that I've kind of learned about leadership that kind of really thrive. One is, how do you act and think like an owner? So often as PMs, if you only are focused on a small portion, you're not really thinking about an end-to-end. So acting like an owner would be, an element of an attribute of this might be championing new ideas, potentially breaking ties, making decisions, learning how to speak candidly, even when it's uncomfortable, and then assuming responsibility for missteps and then sharing credit. Thriving in complexity often is like showing flexibility. You might not have full data. Actually, I'll guarantee that you don't, but focusing on the future, thinking about new opportunities, adapting to changing circumstances. How do you pivot and how do you know when to pivot? And then delivering impact definitely is, there's a saying at Google, which is, we don't reward launches, we reward landings. So it's really thinking about how your product fits in market. So one thought here is at a startup, imagine if you were like the first PM at a startup. You have huge opportunity in terms of leadership and being able to set ownership. Could totally be a chance of a lifetime. On the other hand, depending on if your environment, if you're able to have influence, it can be a moat that you end up being stuck in. So just kind of a thought that it comes with great opportunity, but also may come with, great amount of barriers as well. In a larger company, there's a more traditional path in how you grow out leadership. You're always showing that, but you start with smaller scope and grow out to larger scope. So it's a little bit more structured, but same kind of thing. You can get stuck if you want. The other thing I've kind of realized with leadership is how you want to lead matters. So being able to do things like model humility, or for me, I've really learned that psychological safety on teams is so important for people to bring their best self to work. At a startup, you can run so fast that sometimes those values aren't there. At a startup like mine, one of our values is we're in it together. So from the very beginning, those values end up being there. At a larger company, same thing, depends on the company's values, but you'll often have things like that, but really thinking about how you lead through that. The fifth area I want to talk about here is actually scaling a product organization. So in every environment that you are, product is a team sport. Designers, engineers, marketing, user research. It is not just a product manager's role to build the right product. And so it's very much a team sport. PM as a craft, all these elements of doing everything, you might be put in an environment where you have to do all of them at once. And how do you think about that and how do you grow there? And then product processes. When's the right time to introduce product processes? Because product is such a team sport, one thought here is, in a startup, if you were expected to help the organization understand how to work with product, there needs to be at least the very minimum, some basis of that PM craft. If you were the first PM with no PM experience in a startup, I guarantee you'll learn. You'll probably learn super quickly. You'll probably figure it out, but it'll probably take a little bit long. You'll probably make the same mistakes as many PMs have in the past. Let me give you an example of what it might mean to scale out a product organization or think about how product applies to how you organize work. So this is one example that we have, which was how we organize work. It could be for any company, it could be for a startup. In our world in Common Room, we had a debate of, should we organize work, in terms of like feature teams, or should they be pods? One advantage of something like pods is it very much optimizes for velocity. So pods are designed to be ephemeral. They can come together, they can break apart. They optimize for local decision-making very quickly. They're very flexible and they are autonomous. So the idea is that pods can run independently, how to hit the milestone goal. As long as you're aligned on the milestone goal, you can do whatever you want. You can use whatever products and methods you want, but your role is to just hit the goal. Disadvantages are visibility. Pods mean that you might have a bunch of little things running. And if those end-to-end experiences are broken up amongst pods, it's harder sometimes to have the end-to-end ownership. So you need to make sure you have alignment. And then maintainability. So one of the reasons why feature teams are often, they stay together, is you get some deep product and code ownership in an area. And so that becomes history. It helps when you maintain code bases and large products for existing users. So this is an example of just kind of, as you think about product processes in both, at a startup, you might be in a spot where a lot of what you're doing is figuring out how to do, like how to just run, not just product, not just how to build. At a larger company, you will probably enter a space where a lot of this stuff is already defined. And again, it depends where you are in either one of those products. One thing here I want to talk about is just visibility versus alignment. So regardless of if you're in a large company or a small company, thinking about visibility so that people feel included and know what's going on, versus alignment, that you're aligned with the same set of goals, are kind of two different things, but very related. To create alignment, I often think of things like OKRs, very, very useful to set them at a business level. And then at each pod level, they're also trackable, and you can use that. You can have a common taxonomy to adjust during a milestone. And then to create alignment, I also think a lot about like something called weekly pod reviews. If you have a whole bunch of pods running, how do you think about reviewing them from a leadership team to make sure that people are on the same page? So those are kind of just thoughts of like when to introduce process, not for process sake, but to think about product as like a way that we run. This is one more kind of example of something you might see in a large company or in a startup. And, at a startup, what's the right way to organize work? Maybe you don't need it. I often think of product reviews in 3 stages. One is very early stage. It's often a product pitch, might be an idea to pivot a direction. It's probably focused on like market fit, metrics, articulation of customer value. There's a middle stage, which is much more around reviewing a spec, a PRD, or a deck. That is the end-to-end workflows, very common as well. And then the third stage is really a go to market. Depending on where you are, you want to create visibility on each of those phases. And then this consider do framework is one where in large companies, one of the things I realized is because product reviews are very well established, you kind of know who the stakeholders of the reviews are. If you've heard of different ownership and review models, there's some with that. At a startup, it's not always clear when you give feedback to a pod, how to take that feedback. So one thing that we've introduced is a note-taking system that says consider or do. So a consider kind of gives the pod ownership on taking feedback and then deciding what to do with it. A do framework is a very clear articulation of this is something we want as a leadership team us to do. Please change it before the pod or the feature ships. So just kind of a way of introducing how to take feedback. Okay. I'll end kind of here, or like leave this one here. As you think about what's the right place for you to grow skills. This is a very ugly chart, but really it's a risk versus reward framework. And so thinking about the kind of things that you value as reward, one part of it is learning quickly. One part of it is scope, impact. One part is thinking about what you want your day-to-day to be around, mostly building versus aligning. One might be compensation. One might be leveling. But think about all the things that you find as reward and balance that with the risk that you can take to accelerate all those skills. If you find that you're in a spot where you think it's worth the risk to accelerate growing all these skills, it's such a great place to be in a startup for that reason. You'll find different levels of startups and different levels of big companies, but it's just a way to think about risk versus reward trade-off. Okay, and the last thing I'll end here, I'm going to leave it open for a bunch of questions too, but I think just as you think about where you want to grow skills and how, you'll grow them everywhere. But think about what it is, know that what you want to learn. Think about the risk versus reward. And then if you're interested in trying something new, definitely feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. That was very insightful. For our audience, if you have any questions, I just posted in chat. So feel free to drop your questions or thoughts in the chat, or use the Q&A tab as well in Zoom. And I just wanted to kick us off with one question that was relevant to your last slide on risk versus reward. Do you feel strongly, or do you have any advice for what would be the most ideal starting position for someone who's going into product management? Would you recommend trying out the startup world or a big company, and what would be the pros and cons for either?
Yeah, I noticed in chat, a lot of people are saying they're in large companies.
Yeah.
If you are starting out in product management with no PM experience, I would say the most critical thing is to make sure you're in an environment where you have the right product mentors to learn from. So that means, like, large company, you're going to get it for sure. Established career path, you'll be able to learn a bunch. You might have a smaller scope. If you go to a startup, I would say don't be the first PM in a startup without PM counterparts or a good mentor to learn from. So that would be my only thing. You can't go wrong with either one, but I think the only thing I would recommend against is being the first PM in a startup with no PM mentors.
Would that be something you would try to ask at the interview stage to make sure that you're not the first one there?
Yeah, I mean, I would see what the team is like. And to be honest, like it's a really exciting opportunity to be the first PM in a startup. So it's exciting. But if you have no basis for a PM craft, like no PM internship, no PM, year behind you, I think it would be difficult. Because one of the hardest things I think about our craft is understanding how to create clarity from ambiguity. And you don't yet really have tools. Like I'm sure you'll figure it out. Like it's probably why you're taking that role. But I find it would be, I would personally find it more difficult.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have feedback from Mirabelle. Thank you so much, Mirabelle, for your thoughts. We have a couple of questions already coming in. Good question from Carlos. How to manage a mentorship program inside a big company to teach these skills to PMs?
That's a great one. So I've seen a couple different things with that. There's always your manager, which is very traditional. And then what I've seen in big companies is there's often a set of best practices. So definitely at Microsoft and both Google, it's very common that people will have either a formal or informal mentor assigned to every new person coming in to onboard. So, everything from like, how do you, get your feet wet to like where you can ask questions. Other things I've seen with like a formal mentorship program, I've seen mixed results. Like I've had an amazing mentor at Microsoft that I still keep in touch with here, where it's actually a formal PM mentorship. Often what you want to look for is something potentially 2 levels higher. And in a mentorship program, knowing what you want to learn. So I've had different mentors throughout my career, but I also had an idea what I wanted to learn at that time. When I joined the C# team, I didn't know how to program in C#. So a lot of what I was honing was my craft, my technical craft, domain space, learning technical skills, making sure I have cred with the engineering team. I outgrew that mentor pretty quickly. But then I got to a phase where I was a PM, IC PM moving to a PM lead. That's a whole different world where you're trying to figure out, like, you're very, very good at what you do, and now you need to enable a team to do that. And so a lot of, one common mistake of new managers is micromanaging. And so at that phase, finding a mentor who understood how to be a lead and who had, maybe in the last 2 to 4 years had kind of gone through that was really helpful. I've had mentors at different stages later on, which were, now I was scaling teams or thinking about very large pivots to an existing business. And finding somebody like that. So I would think about a mentorship program where you think about the right levels, and then also a degree of what you would learn and how you would match those skills.
Super useful. Thank you. I have another question from Kevin. What are the most common missteps you see new PMs make at startups versus big companies?
That's a great one. So, the thing with startups is everyone is in it together, and you're going to keep trying things. So you have to be very comfortable with the ambiguity, even as an engineer, because things will change. We'll change our process. We'll try something else. We will potentially break things. We may not have all our metrics up and running. So you have to be very comfortable with the ambiguity. I think maybe one thing I've seen, I don't know if it's unique to startups, but startups have one of the largest risks in a startup is not prioritizing well and not being able to focus, because you're clearly in a space that oftentimes you're in a space where there is a market and a pain point that is not yet being addressed. And so you have so much to do. And all of it will provide customer value. So I think that maybe the largest one might be not being able to prioritize and focus the team, which means you'll end up doing a little bit of everything and not finishing something full through.
It's very quickly along those lines. The skill of prioritization is very important for PMs to hone, I believe, at every different stages of company. Do you think for startup versus big company, it's more important?
I think it's important for both. I actually think one of the failure points for probably all PMs is not being able to figure out how to prioritize. It's really interesting. At my current company, we do a written exercise when PMs come in. And at one point I had rewritten the PM exercise, and my CTO engineering, the co-founder was like, wait, we need to give prioritization on it so that PMs will come in and know which one to solve first. And I was like, actually, no, the exercise is designed exactly not to do that, because it will weed out great PMs. It will weed out the great PMs, because every great PM will come in, and without being told you should prioritize against 4 problems, they will pick a stack rank. And the ones that don't are the ones that you would not be great here. So yeah, I agree. Like, prioritization is important for both, but really important. Yeah, really important for both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you for your question, Kevin. Another question from Adrian. Could you comment on how you see innovation develop in a startup versus big company? Maybe things that work in one but not the other.
Yeah. So I've actually used I've used a similar trait in both. And Google has this concept of design sprints, which we've recently just used for a strategy jam. And it's kind of this idea of how might we? It's this exercise, how might we? And it's an exercise of, like, strategy is really 3 things. Like, what is it you're trying to build? What pain points, how are you going to differentiate and do that? And then how does it result in something better for somebody? So I've seen there's more room for innovation in startups because people are willing to take more risks. So that's one area that just fosters innovation. If you're willing to take more risk and iterate faster, it's a great environment for that. I've seen that at some big companies too. One of the reasons I actually ended up at Google was when I was a chief of staff, one of the things that we tried to study was, once you're a large company, how does innovation happen? There are 2 models that we saw across many, many different companies that I interviewed. One is you create an incubation team. So you have a main team that already has existing users. You have existing revenue, and you're very careful not to break that. And then you form an incubation team that you let have a year, have a set of metrics, but you try to determine if they are going to build something that basically replaces the old, the larger one, or people will take the existing company and then build an incubation, like they might have like a set of people that will like go explore 5 different things inside the large company. But there's always a tension of how do you innovate on something new, potentially in the space of your existing product and your existing product, and then that tension balances. So I definitely think if you're in an environment where people are able to take risks, you're able to iterate, you are not afraid to kind of fail fast. It's a really great environment for that.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Adrian. I was thinking back in the beginning of your presentation when you mentioned that when you were chief of staff, you spent a lot of time thinking and building one big team, and then just investing into building out a culture within that organization. Have you noticed in your experience whether the culture is different and the process of building culture is different in a big company versus a startup?
Yeah, definitely. Although elements are the same. So you have less, it also depends where you are in a larger organization. But in a large organization, as a chief of staff, it was like a 3,000 person org. That was the intention. So there was a lot of room to craft and to discover what were already cultural elements we had. So I worked for the developer division at Microsoft, and, if we did a couple things. We had an external consultant kind of come in and just like do a ton of interviews with people at many different levels to get a 360 view of what we thought our culture was. And because we were a developer organization, one of our cultural values was actually to be very helpful. And you'll see that with developers, they want to help other people. We also had like a very high standard for what it meant to be productive. And so those were elements of the culture we wanted to keep. Microsoft at that time was closed source. So you didn't know what was going to get shipped. And there was a wave and a movement happening that had already happened that was around open source culture, that things are better made and shared. And, when you build on the shoulders of giants of things that are open source, you just get better things for the world. So we kind of went through this phase when I was the chief of staff, where it was actually literally trying to change the culture from a closed source culture to an open source culture. And then what does that mean? So in that world, it was people had an appetite for cultural change. And so establishing the culture, if it was open source, how does that work for the promo process? How does that work for how we think about code? How does that work for PMs who are working open source and being comfortable with people seeing, things coming out in code? That was very similar. For a startup, I find there's just an appetite to set who you are. So those values, like people will often, I actually don't even know of startup, like many startups will already have that culture. They will be picking them, and you'll be iterating and refining them, but there's such an appetite to think about how you work as a team.
Yeah, thank you for going deeper into that. Appreciate it. Noticing that we have a lot of people from large companies in our audience. One thing that I'm wondering myself, and maybe it could be useful to the audience as well, throughout your career, being in different companies, how do different levels compare of your journey within the PM career? And how can you know, going from company to company, and especially if you're going from a bigger company to a startup, that you're kind of leveling up with the expectations for the role?
Yeah, that's a great answer. For the big company, it's a lot easier. There, definitely like websites like levels.fyi that like, we'll compare a Microsoft to a Google to even, like an Uber or an Airbnb. And so those become a lot easier in that as long as you have somebody in those companies, and or you can reference information on the internet, you can roughly get a sense of like, maybe this level of PM should map to this. The other determination sometimes is comp. The comparison from a large company to startup does not really apply. So the equation of your risk reward is so different. So there's clearly compensation that you want, and then there's clearly equity that you have in the company. but the risk and reward trade-off, though, it's not as clear, because the opportunities you're going to get in a startup to move that quickly, and depending on what phase the company is in, you might actually define, a product that is in the next wave of things, and like be one of the first as the company scales. So it's very difficult to trade off there. And I'll find that if you're thinking about from a big company to startup, I think it's knowing your, for me, as an example, it was like knowing what my number needed to be so that I could not be anxious about money, for instance. But the rest of it was intangible. Like, you should not expect to get paid the same amount at a large company at a startup. It doesn't quite work that way. The equity is often the trade-off, but you probably wouldn't go to the startup if you didn't believe in its future. So the equity is for me, for sure, was where we put more of the thought.
Interesting, and thank you for sharing that. We have a couple more questions come in. One, what about moving from startup to big company? How would you help somebody map themselves there?
Yeah, that's what I did. So I moved from a startup moving from a startup to big company. That's a great question. So at a startup, you will have had experiences that you may not have had until like many levels of more senior levels at a larger company. So I would certainly think about like getting credit for that as an example. I think the thought is how many years you're at that startup and then how that startup phased. So if you were at a startup, if you were at a startup for 5 years and the startup actually took off, like that is like a lifetime of like product experience, right? That's the difference between Uber being company and then not being company, or Airbnb being company and not. You can go from beginning to IPO in that phase, and you would have gone through every phase. It would have meant that you already had to like reinvent yourself, give away your Legos, and scale your organization. If you were at a startup for like 3 years and the startup maybe didn't get another round or kind of didn't succeed, then it's way harder to measure, but it is like a ton of credit that you were there. So I certainly think you would be, you probably wouldn't be just an entry-level PM at that point, but it's a little bit trickier depending on where your startup ended up.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. And we have one more in chat. Any suggestion to transition to PM? Most companies need experience.
Yeah, transition to PM for sure. Like most companies do need experience if you are transitioning to another company. If you have the opportunity if you have great support kind of in your current role, it's such a good place. Like in a lot of the two companies I had, Microsoft and Google, Google had an official kind of 20% rotation, which was such a great place for thinking about switching a product. And I've had people who ended up converting full-time product, and some people on my team who like decided this is not what I want to do. But that is a more formal program. But if you have a manager that's really supportive, and they kind of know your aspirations are, I've often seen people be able to take on product type of projects in context of their current role. And that's a great way to get experience. There was a PM on my old team at Google who, he was a doc writer, so he knew the domain space really well, but he took on one miniature project that shipped, from ideation to all the way to landing it in market. And like that was enough to talk about the product experience that he did a full conversion. But if you have the opportunity to do it in your current role, it's awesome. If you don't, I really think about like, there's a bunch of different like product communities. Like this is one of them. I'm just learning the craft. Some people have gone to boot camps, but like getting that kind of experience is great. Sometimes it's easier to transition, like startups will entertain more some of that. But again, I would not advise being the first PM with no PM experience going to a startup. You will probably it's just hard. You'll learn really very, very fast, but you'll probably make a bunch of mistakes too. And it's just great to have mentors around you.
Thank you. And yeah, good question. In our final minutes, I also wanted to make time for the shout outs, and maybe we can, given the topic, combine the shout outs and some final questions. So if any questions come up, please feel free to put them in chat or Q&A right now. But also, if any of you are looking for new positions or your companies are hiring, feel free to drop the links to the career pages in the chat, or share your LinkedIn profile, your email addresses if you'd like to stay in touch with the rest of the audience here. And also, like I said, just to combine the shout outs and the topic today, I wanted to end on one more question. If someone is evaluating a startup, a potential startup, and want to proceed their career being in the startup, Karen, in your experience, or what would be your thought process of how to evaluate a startup company if you want to progress your career?
Yeah. Well, there's one, which is just to evaluate the startup. So not all startups succeed, not all startups well, and you kind of need to understand what you want to learn. I would definitely do your due diligence on the startup itself, which is are they in a market you believe in? What kind of customer base do they have? Where are they in their funding? What are their outstanding shares? But do your due diligence to make sure, like, what is a team like? A lot of what makes or breaks startup too is the team. That's one. And then I think to evaluate what you want to learn, again, it's really, if you're in a space, you will learn so much so quickly at a startup. But you might be a person who enjoys structure, or you like even a couple years at a big company. One of the things that big companies have is they have a performance model or a career model. So at the very minimum, you'd have an understanding of, like, what does it have to have these 7 competencies at this level? And then as you progress that level, what does it look like? You can get that at a startup as well if you have like the right PM product leadership too in place, but it's less structured because there probably isn't a performance or career ladder yet. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I would definitely think about what you want to learn, and then also what your risk tolerance is. If you thrive in ambiguity, you want the opportunity and you want a larger scope, you'll get that very, very quickly, I think, at a startup.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think we do not have any other questions, and I think it's a good place to end our conversation today. Karen, once again, thank you so much for the presentation and answering all our questions. I really appreciated your very open feedback and advice that you have to give to our product community. And thank you for the audience for being engaged and asking really good questions. Definitely made for a really good discussion today. So thanks again. Please join us for next event that will happen next month. You can find all the events on Meetup, products.com, or Eventbrite, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next webinars. Thank you so much, and hope everyone has a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Irina.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.